who are here start meandering in. We're going to conclude last Wednesday night's discussion by hearing what you have to say, observations, insights you might have from what we discussed last week. All we have are the notes from last week. Okay. And then if we conclude that at a certain time, I'll introduce to you next Wednesday night's project that'll have a handout that'll be the discussion starter for you to begin thinking about, that we'll start the discussion next Wednesday. I'll go over that if we have time tonight. If not, I'll just hand it out to you and quickly review it so you can think about it during the week, so when we get together, we can have a fairly informed and directed discussion. But tonight we want to follow up on what we handed out last week on whether or not believers or how believers should respond to gun violence in America. And if you don't have the notes from last week and you want them, we have about 15 more copies up here if you need that. And if not, that's certainly okay too. Let's have a word of prayer, and then I'll throw some things out to you and see if any of you have anything to add or say to that. Our Heavenly Father, we do thank you that we have the opportunity to, in a safe environment, sit down and discuss what we believe and what we think, and how we think would be a wise way to respond to our culture that seems to be more rapidly than ever drifting away from traditional values as well as biblical and Christian values, and it puts us in a precarious situation as to how to speak the truth without offending those who've never heard the truth and think that what we say is bigoted or racist or uncaring or unsympathetic, and that we might have the wisdom to be as harmless as doves, even while being wise as serpents. May you guide this discussion tonight and help us, all of us, have a better grasp of how we might personally and privately react to conversations that we are in. For we ask that in Jesus' name. Amen. You know, a lot of the things that the world thinks about the church or thinks about what the church teaches and preaches doesn't come necessarily from the pulpit. It's from their interactions with Christians and their daily conversations. So I think it's important for everyday church members and lay people to be well informed as to what is a biblical framework from which to interpret a scenario. That being said, the biblical framework doesn't always lead two ardent believers to the same conclusion. So we have to give each other grace that two people who truly love the Lord and love the Word of God might not come to the same conclusion as to how you apply that truth to the culture. And I'm sure it would be that way if you and I were talking to believers from other countries where they don't have the freedoms that we have. We would have an immediate response to what we should say or do, while they've been trained by maybe even centuries of knowing what they can or cannot say as Christians and keeping their mouths quiet about certain social issues that they don't even bring up because they're focusing simply on having the privilege, or not even maybe privilege, just worshiping in safety. And they don't want to imperil that because the worship and the gathering is more important than them speaking to the culture because they don't have the platform to speak to the culture. So the way that, how do impoverished or imprisoned or persecuted believers affect their culture? They do it by winning people to Christ. And that number swells and grows until every once in a while somebody gets saved who's from a position of influence, who then, that influence then trickles down in the culture, and that might take centuries. We forget that it was well over 300 years between Christ and the acceptance of the Roman Empire of saying Christianity can legally exist. 300 years, that's longer than the history of America. Imagine the patience it takes to accept that as a reality and then let that hone what's important to the church. We have been blessed and then highly influenced by American freedom for 250 years. That we have the right to say what we believe and to say it publicly. So if we are told that we can't preach on the street corner, we take that as an offense. You can't tell me what I can or cannot do, but in other countries, many believers, they would never even think of preaching on a street corner because that might be instant imprisonment or death or stoning, and then put your family at risk. During the Olympics, we had the chance to hear the story of the North Korean, that big cheerleading squad and all their athletes, that one of the ways the Korean government keeps them in check is by letting them know, yeah, you might escape, but your family's still back in North Korea. So they might have all the courage in the world to defect, but they know their courage means suffering for somebody else, so it holds them back. Well, believers in other countries know the same thing, countries that are not free, that their courage to speak out means hardship for other people, and that's worse than hardship for yourself. So I want to encourage you to keep that in mind as we talk about how we should respond to things. I think we should factor in the freedoms we have here, and we should take advantage of them. For years, in my earlier years as a believer, a lot of the churches I attended sort of emphasized Christians should stay out of politics, and political issues should never come from the pulpit. And that was a pretty dominant philosophy in evangelical churches. So as we didn't speak out publicly, people like me who were newly saved and then had been in the church for 3 or 4 years at that time were completely unaware of what the real cultural issues are and how the Bible would apply to it, to the point, and it's sad to even think now, I didn't know anything about abortion or it being wrong or immoral or what it was till I got to Bible college. And Jerry Falwell, ripped that veil into and described what it was in a church service live on Old Time Gospel Hour, showed videos and said, this is going on in America to the point of 1.5 million a year. We got to do something about it. By that time, I had been saved 8th grade, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th. I've been saved 5 years, heard the Bible preach every Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, had never heard anything about abortion. But that was the tact of the church back then. Now, maybe there was an overcompensation. Maybe the church got too political. That's all up for debate. But we have an obligation in some sense to utilize the freedoms that we have. So when it comes to elections, and some believers choose not to vote or not to express their political views and allow whoever's going to win, just allow them to win. And I can understand that to be true if you're in a country where your vote really has no impact on anything. You've got to accept reality as it is. But in America, we can still impact legislation locally, statewide, and federally. And we do that by electing officials democratically who then go and they represent us in the creation and implementation of laws. So in my mind, it would be foolish for a believer not to utilize that freedom. Why wouldn't we exercise that power that our culture has granted to us? Why wouldn't we use it for good if we have it? So please keep all that in mind, that that's not true around the world, but we still have that influence. So we have an ability to respond to this question. Gun violence in America, what should be the church's position on gun ownership, on gun usage, handguns, firearms, assault rifles, whatever you might say? Shouldn't we have a position or a philosophy on it, and is the world expecting one? And I can tell you they are expecting one, and they're expecting one of two: for us to be complete NRA, neophyte promoters and committed people to blowing everybody away, or we're going to say no guns at all. And it's pretty much one of those two. Nothing in here is going to make them happy. So don't think that any position you take that sort of takes them and morphs them is going to make the world happy. They want to be able to put us in as gun-crazed, Bible-clinging, gun-shooting anarchists against the culture, or they want us to be completely given over to their viewpoint, which would include the other issues in our culture, which is going to be probably next week's topic. So as we posed the question last week, how should we respond? We want to factor in what credibility still remains in the evangelical church in the culture's mind. What platform do we really have? Do we want to stand up in the middle of nowhere and speak out and nobody hears it? Is that any really effect? And then if we do have a platform, what is a truly wise, comprehensive grasp of this issue? So last week we just simply brought up the issue, sort of, and I may have done it from a halfway leaning, biased Second Amendment supporting position. But I wanted to hear what you had to say, and Matt has a microphone. Any insights, anecdotes, angles of which to look at it that you think we as Christians should consider, knowing that we right here in this conversation are going to have absolutely no effect on what happens in the next week. But maybe out of this conversation, we might be more affirmed or knowledgeable about the issue, and we talk to somebody who talks to somebody and talks to somebody. And I don't want to bring up any particular names, but years ago we did a study here on the Constitution of the United States, and it was a pretty rapid one, I think 7 or 8 weeks, but we recorded it, and I provided it to a political leader, and the political leader responded that that was just incredibly essential to their position on some issues because they had never heard that presentation of the Constitution before. And this was a person who was serving in Congress. So, I can't do anything about it, but that person might be able to take that philosophy and make sure something's protected. So don't dismiss the impact you can have, but don't overinflate it either. But so this is just the beginning of us talking so that we can speak intelligently. So we have the issue of gun control. There is some level of gun legislation that controls who can get it. In some ways, it's fairly free and open. In other ways, it might be restricted. There's some people who can't get weapons. There's some weapons you can't get without special permission. But the culture is crying for tighter legislation of, number one, assault rifles. That's the primary focus. Make those unavailable to everybody. So I want to talk about what do you think of that? What could we do to restrict a mentally unstable person from getting that? Are there any laws that could actually do that? And then can it be confined to that? Or is it going to keep encroaching on more? So if you have a thought, a statement, a question, raise your hand and Matt will bring you the microphone. Knowing that people on live stream are watching. Maybe not tonight, but they might watch tomorrow, the next day. So don't mention any names or don't insult anybody if you can possibly avoid it.
Well, I guess my thoughts begin with the fact that what happened at this high school in Florida was horrific. And our hearts and prayers go out to those who survived and the parents and families of those who lost children. The issue that I see here is that all watchful eyes, all protections that were supposedly in place went awry. What was the poem? The best laid plans of mice and men aft gang awry. And they certainly did. There were apparently a lot of warnings about this individual. So it happened, and as is from what my 70 plus years has taught me, once again, we are going to have some type of, for want of a better term, a knee-jerk reaction. The anti-gun folks are going to use this as a stepping stone. And I think what most of us who consider ourselves law-abiding gun owners are concerned about is that if one thing is outlawed, it's the beginning of the slippery slope. If you take away the assault rifles. Personally, I'm not a fan of assault rifles. Don't own one, don't want one. But that's just me. There are those folks who thoroughly enjoy them and apparently use them for whatever reasons. I think that if you look at different things that have happened in history, there was a fellow named Timothy McVeigh that did a whole lot more damage with some fertilizer and fuel oil than this fellow did with his weaponry. I don't know that we'll ever stop incidents like this until we as a country look at issues such as this young man and say everyone knew he had a problem, but no one was willing to do anything. No one wanted to abuse his rights. No one wanted to deal with him. If we don't start dealing with folks who have these kinds of problems, there's going to be more of what happened here. Doesn't matter whether it's a gun or a bomb or a guy driving a car through a crowd of people. How many times hasn't that recently, and I've not seen anyone out there trying to outlaw vehicles. I just find that we have. I this afternoon caught a little bit of our president's statements. I think he has said he's going to outlaw the bump stocks, which, you know, right now there's a law in place. You can own a fully automatic firearm. It's called a Class 3. In order to do that, you pay a very high licensing fee. It's regulated. The BATF can come in and inspect it, a whole bunch of things. So it's not that you can't own one. You can, but there are so many restrictions, not a lot of people do, because you have to pay that license every year, and it's not cheap. The bump stock, I don't get the purpose of that other than someone coming up with another gimmick. So he even called on the NRA in this point that, I forget his exact words, but okay, guys, it's time we all look at some compromise here. And maybe that is a point we have reached. If I remember properly, some of the laws were stricter several years back. You couldn't buy a weapon or a gun with more than a certain round count in the magazine. In other words, you couldn't have the 17-round auto pistols, what have you. They limited that. And then over time, that got beat back down again, and they opened it up. I don't know that had this individual not had access to what we term as an assault rifle, could he still have committed the carnage that he did? Probably pouring gasoline in some bottles and sticking a rag in the end and pulling that fire alarm and lighting them as the kids came out and throwing them into the groups. Could have maybe just done as much, but that's not what he did. He used the gun. I don't know that there's a simple solution, but as Christians, I cannot for one sit here and say, oh my goodness, we have to disarm Americans. That, to me, that's a fundamental right of self-preservation, self-protection, and it's the bad. There are bad people in this world who are going to be bad people and do bad things no matter how many laws we put out there.
All right. Thank you. That's a good summary of last week's presentation, pretty much. Yeah. Ashley, go back over to Ashley. While he's going there, the point that we want to keep in mind is there is no simple answer, first of all. We know that because 50 years ago this wasn't happening and guns were still present. There's a cultural thing going on that has nothing to do with the guns. The guns is the expression of it, the misuse of guns. So a law is not going to fix that. So there's no simple, I think we resolved last week, it's going to have to be a comprehensive approach, and that won't necessarily come from the government. Ashley.
Okay, I'm going to play devil's advocate just a little bit. I'll preface it as we are both pro-Second Amendment, own lots of firearms. I've had a concealed carry permit since I was 21. So with that being said, to look at the mental health side of things, I'm a speech therapist, and one of my jobs working in rehab and skilled nursing facilities in the hospital is to do cognitive evaluations on people after strokes, with Parkinson's, with dementia. And in that, I can't determine competency. I can't say this person cannot make their own decisions, but I can refer to a psychologist or the primary care physician who can use my evaluation and determine it from there. With that being said, driving a car in the United States is a right. You can take a test, You can get a permit, a learner's permit to start with, then your driver's license. But at some point, if you aren't physically or cognitively able to drive anymore, that can be revoked and you're no longer able to drive. And that seems very, very simple, but I don't know if you said a statistic last week on car accidents and deaths with that. I forget what it was.
Yeah, it was. Well, I didn't print it out for today, but
It's okay.
yeah,
Long
it
story
was
short,
high,
it's a
much
lot
higher.
of people.
88,000 at least.
Right. So we have people driving on our roads in our community every single day, and you're more likely to be killed in a car accident than you are being shot by a firearm. That being said, because you can get that revoked, I'm kind of for the mental health checks, because, not to say that I think I should be allowed to own a firearm. I don't think I have any mental incapacities to say that I can't. Someone else may test me and say differently, but I don't think that's a bad thing at all, restricting that, if we can do that with a vehicle that can hurt people. And so as law-abiding citizens who are competent to own and utilize a firearm, I don't have anything against restricting mental health. How you would do that, I don't know. Psychologists aren't allowed to report a lot because of privacy laws, so that would have to be changed, and I don't know what that looks like, but I think that there's a big component that we're missing on that end of people who know information and legally are bound and cannot say the information that could keep someone like this from doing harm to others.
Very good point. And that was a part of the Broward situation, because information about that young man was not accessible because of some previously implemented laws that prevented the sharing of the information because of an attempt to prevent inner city poverty-stricken students from going straight from high school to jail. So there were agreements made and payments made, and monies could be obtained by schools and law enforcement agencies for not reporting certain level crimes from a certain demographic. And he was in that demographic. So that's one of the things that what she brought up, which I think is very logical, but being on the Sarasota Bioethics Committee at the hospital, one of the issues, and everybody here is a veteran, you have to know this, if you are a veteran, it is an assumed PTSD state. So any veteran would automatically be at risk of losing your right to carry a firearm, under the assumption that if you have been trained with the weapon and have been able to use it, that causes a mental duress that will sometimes show up. If you've ever been in conflict, you are suffering from PTSD whether you know it or not. And I've been in these conversations where the doctors and the nurses are saying we need to have the legal authority to confiscate weapons from anybody that we deem to be in PTSD. So let's say Ashley has a weapon and she's totally competent, but 5 years from now, something horrible happens in her life, and they want to come now get the guns because they evaluate that she might be a risk for mental instability. That's where that gray area comes in. It's a good idea in principle, but when it's applied, somebody's rights are going to get infringed on. And I was actually quite frightened when I heard these people that I respect and admire talking about just blanketly saying, once anybody is out of military service, all their guns should be confiscated. That's the safest thing to do because people are coming home whacked out from Afghanistan, Iraq, and all that. Well, that's a forfeiture of a lot of people who've served our country faithfully, who now are giving up a Second Amendment right because they served so all that's a very good point, and I think there is a balance in there. You see how it opens up into just abuse. Do you have something to say, dude?
So I'll say this. Ashley mentioned we are firearm owners. We own bump stocks. We own more assault rifle style guns than we can put on both of our hands. I enjoy shooting them. People call them modern sporting rifles. The rifle that I hunt with, a lot of people say, well, why would you have an AR-15, AR-10, whatever? You don't use them for hunting. I use my AR-10 for hunting. That's my deer hunting rifle. AR-15 shoots a .223 or .556 round. My AR-10 shoots a much more powerful round. It's a .308 round. I can put 20 rounds in one magazine. It's a very powerful firearm, but that's my hunting rifle. Ashley and I did not discuss this before we came to the meeting. There's actually a statute in California. It's called the Gun Violence Restraining Order. It's very similar. I think it was passed in 2014, 2016. Very similar to the Baker Act. So if you know someone, you have a family member, you're living with someone, you have a son or daughter, in this case, I guess the gentleman's, I don't want to call him a gentleman, the person's parents passed away, but the people that were taking care of this person that killed these 17 students, or 15 students, 2 teachers, there's a gun violence restraining order in the state of California where you can report someone, say they are not stable enough to own a firearm. They go through the same procedures as a Baker Act, just like someone's, you think they might commit suicide or cause harm to others. Well, they will go, the court, it's a court order thing, law enforcement will go check out the mental stability of someone, and if they're mentally unstable, they will go ahead and take away their firearms. I do not like too many California-only laws or statutes. This is one that I'm probably supportive of, and I think it could have potentially prevented, this mass shooting at the school. Putting restrictions on firearms, which are tools. We have 30 million firearms in the United States, something like that.
270 million.
Okay, maybe it's 30 million assault.
Yeah, maybe assault
rifle style guns. I could go out all day long if I am not legally allowed to buy a firearm and go illegally buy a firearm. I can go down to Miami, go on a lot of street corners and go buy a firearm illegally that can't be traced. One of my high school buddies that hung out with the wrong crowd and now he's dead, he overdosed on opioids. He had an illegally purchased firearm. They're very easy to purchase. I don't think putting restrictions on guns is really going to do much for that person that wants to go out and they're dead set. It's a mission to go commit, mass casualty. Like I said, that statute is something to look up. I just learned about it the other day. Someone sent me a text about an article about this gun violence restraining order.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe something y'all could look up. And
it would make sense, but then, as always, it makes sense, and then how it's going to be applied and who makes those determinations. Yes, sir. Right behind him.
I'm new here.
Tony, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I think that many good points were brought out, and as far as the point that you brought, as far as Christians being involved with what is going on, I think it would be hazardous to society if C.S. Lewis or Dietrich Bonhoeffer or Martin Luther or John Newton or William Wilberforce piously sat on their hands and didn't get involved.
Amen.
History would be changed, and not for the better. Having said that, we also have to realize as Christians that we have to look at the society around us, and as Jesus said, to notice the times and notice what is going on. We can talk about guns all day long, but in this particular circumstance, and in Boston, and in many other areas, there has been a huge institutional breakdown. I still haven't heard a thing from the FBI about what happened. What happened? They were warned 3 times. They were warned in Boston by the Russians nonetheless, and nothing happened. What happened with the Broward Police Department? Why did, word has it, 4 deputies didn't go in? I mean, we could talk about, gun control and taking Ashley's point further, and supposing that you keep someone from driving a car. Are we going to talk about car control? Or hatchet control? Or is it just gun control? But what about the cities that have adopted very strict gun control laws, like Chicago, like Baltimore, like Atlanta, like Detroit. These cities have the toughest gun control laws, and what is their crime rate doing? It's not going down, it's going through the roof. The term outlaw is exactly that, outside of law. And if there's one thing that they learned about prohibition, is that outlaws will get what they need regardless. If you put on gun control, you're going to take it away probably from the people who want to defend themselves. It wasn't by accident that Simi Valley had a lot of destruction before the first Rodney King trial, but the second Rodney King trial, guess what? Gun sales went through the roof. No violence in Simi Valley. Isn't that amazing? So when we take into consideration all of these facts, and we also take into consideration the accountability that we have as Christians, the accountability that we have as citizens, to hold our institutions accountable. I, quite frankly, before anything is decided at an individual level, I want to know what happened at the institutional level. Mm-hmm. I want to know why they failed us. Had the FBI acted, that young man would not have been in the position that he was in, and we would not be talking about it right now.
And it's true, and not just the FBI. It's the mental health industry in the United States has greatly been reduced to the point that in Sarasota, mental health patients have just been released from institutions out onto the street because the programs were shut down. And as you, of course, you know, even with Mr. Cruz, mental illness has a great deal to do with those kind of improper use of guns. And so, yeah, thank you for those words, Tony. Where are you now, Michael?
First of all, I'd like to commend you on this handout. It was excellent.
Thank you.
You must have put in many hours on that. But I'd like to take us back to why this country is and why it was founded. It was founded by our founders for freedom of religion. They came here for the freedom of religion, which I think it's up to all Christians to try and protect. Saying that, if you take a look at the Second Amendment, they put in a right for firearms, and it says a well-regulated militia. Now people try and turn that around to, oh, well, that means National Guard, et cetera, and so on and so forth. I would like to point out to people, and I don't know how many have followed it, but basically the well-regulated militia in the beginning, a lot of it happened to be regiments from churches with the leader of that group, the pastor of the church. So basically, Christians were involved to begin with. The Second Amendment was put into place to try and protect our country from being taken over and run again by a government, and it was put in place so that the people themselves could protect them against that happening. If there is disarmament of the people, it lends itself to a takeover. And if you want to look back in history, every dictatorship that has ever existed, what they have done is taken away all the weapons from the people. So the fact that Second Amendment was put in place is really amazing that our forefathers thought about that to begin with. So I think when we start thinking about whether we should be armed, whether people should have guns or not, I think the answer is yes, people should have guns. They should use them responsible. And it's not the gun itself that caused the damage, it's the person behind the gun. So basically, I will tell you, like you, I have firearms and I intend to keep them because I think I have a responsibility to not only protect myself and my family, but I think I have a responsibility toward our country to protect our country from ever being taken over by a dictatorship. And then basically going back to the failures of this last case, yes, it was preventable. The law enforcement failed, and that includes the FBI. There is an interesting account that's available on the internet, and I don't have it with me, but basically What happened that precluded all of this from happening was in Miami they had a high crime rate, so the politicians and the school district got in concert with each other and started not reporting.
It's called the
So
Promise,
that-
the Promise
yeah.
program with President
then-
Obama. Yeah.
Then Broward County followed them, so they weren't reporting all the instances. So what happens? Well, the police, if you're not reporting, well, it's no big deal. That somewhat explains why there wasn't action by that deputy, and I think he's really a fall guy for the mistakes that were made higher up.
Well, thanks for the review there. The history of the Second Amendment is a fascinating study, but one little factoid to put in there. Remember when the Constitution was drawn up, it was after we had won our independence. The focus of the Constitution was not protecting us against England. It was protecting states' rights against the federal government encroachment military imposed. So the idea, the militias were the citizenry. That part of the wall of freedom is the citizens being able to say no to the federal government, because if you read the history of those debates in the Federalist Papers, it was all about individual states saying, we don't want to surrender our rights to a central government. So that Second Amendment was put in there not to curb us. It was to curb the federal government. As a matter of fact, the entire Constitution is written to curb the federal government and to protect the states' rights, which was the real reason behind the Civil War, the war between the states. So as you study that history, it becomes you are amazed at the wisdom of our founding fathers. Absolutely, how God assembled these brilliant people at that time to pull off the absolute impossible and then put together a constitution that would protect those rights for hundreds of years when people are, by design, selfish and hostile and violent and greedy and full of avarice. Yet this incredible document that's fairly short compared to every law that takes place now. Every law that's written now was longer than the entire Constitution. Just brilliant, brilliant people. Yes, sir.
I'm having mixed emotions about what I want to say because I have a sense of violence about me. And I'm afraid someone's going to say, take him off in a little corner somewhere and keep him there.
We can do that for you if you need it.
But I hear quite often someone saying, why doesn't someone tell us about these things that are happening that are adverse to the continuation of our great country? And my response is, do you remember Waco? Waco was on the front pages of nearly every paper in the United States. And I well remember what they said didn't exist in Texas, in Waco rather, was a fire tank, a tank that shot
Flames,
fire,
yeah.
flamethrower. Supposedly there wasn't a tank like that anywhere near Waco, but they had abrogated their responsibility to arrest the man that they were talking about. He went into town almost every day. They could have arrested him, but instead they burned a public building down to the ground and killed I don't know how many people, children included.
187, something like that, right?
And the grace of it was presented to us as just as something. It was the greatest cover-up in our history.
You know what? When that point he made is, and I don't want to. I'm not a conspiracy advocate, but I certainly don't really truly trust the American government. The system I do, but not the political arm. But in Nazi Germany, when they were first beginning their purging of the people to get rid of mentally retarded and deformed people, they would come to the house under the mantle of we want to take your child and take your child to a wonderful facility where they will be happy and taken care of. And on the vehicles, the name of the vehicle was the Charitable Transport Company, was what was posted on the van. The vans picked up these children and took them right to gas chambers. It was the presentation of, we're doing this for your children, and we're taking them to burn them. And then you look at Waco, and remember the entire emphasis was, we've got to save the children, we've got to save the children are at risk. We went in there and, because of the actions, killed all the children. As bizarre of a man as, I forget his name now, David Koresh, as he wasn't the one who killed the children. It was the military assault that went wrong. But it was under the impression of, we want to save the children, yet we ended up killing them all. We have to be very careful sometimes with intent and implementation and hidden agendas. And whenever you get people involved or politics, there is always a hidden agenda. And the agenda that's presented might not be the real one. Well, we need to be, wise as serpents, as we're being harmless as doves, to keep a watchful eye on our government and don't just give them carte blanche. But that's what the Constitution's for. That's what voting is for. That's what getting involved in the process is about, is to bring checks in there. And for quite a long time now, the 3-check balance of the federal government has been reduced down to one prominent 12-man group who makes all the laws. It says what's not legal and what is, and it's not the Congress, it's the Supreme Court. So our country's being changed while we're sitting here watching it. It's morphing into something else other than the 3-branch government. Phyllis, go ahead.
I was just reading an article today where the parliament in South Africa had voted to take all of the property away from the white farmers. And I just kept remembering the past few years how that's actually been happening here in the United States, where we're being pitted against each other in the races, and how, as Christians, how we react to that. I mean, I think as a Christian and as a white person, I kind of like want to, buckle up, and protect my race, whatever. But as Christians, we shouldn't be falling for that. And that part really, really concerns me. You think that it can happen there, it can happen here.
Yes.
That somebody decides you're this race or that race, and you can't have anything. So.
And like what Tony brought up a minute ago, if we remain silent, we really have no platform to complain and gripe when things turn sour, because we have the privilege and the right to be vocal. So if we're not vocal and things go bad, we have nobody really to blame but ourselves. Now, once the power is taken out of our hands and things go south, we have to deal with it maybe differently, like other believers in tyrannical governments have to. But right now, we have the privilege to speak out and express our. But my danger, as I mentioned last week, is we often speak out completely uninformed. We speak in cliches and sound bites, rather than really understanding the issue and speaking articulately and calmly and dispassionately. We have to remove the emotion of the moment from the long-term argument so we can speak with wisdom, which is what our founding fathers did. Incredible wisdom to remove this and look long. What about 75 years from now? What do we decide now that will affect those people? So what the founding fathers did was craft something for posterity, for the future. That's how we should think as believers. Of all people, we should be the ones thinking like that.
I want to make a comment about the media, that we need to pay attention to what they say, but also what they do not say, and test them, just like the Bible says, and listen to a lot of them as much as you can, to listen to the others, listen to Limbaugh, so then I know what everybody else is saying. So that would be the issue that I would say. It's important for Christians to know that what they may hear may not be the whole thing. And another thing I wanted to mention was that had this young man, his name had been other than Cruz, maybe he would have been reported, had all the issues that he had and all the things. So, and as a Hispanic, I see that, and I say that is wrong, and that was why he got away with all the things that he got away with, because they were with that promise thing that was given to us by former president, a gift of him, so that they will not show so much the minorities, blacks, Hispanics, and all of that, as having committed crimes, and they never looked at the type of crime that they were committed. So it was just carte blanche. If he was Hispanic, or if he was black, or if she was, then we will not report it, and that's what the situation is.
If we want to be wise, we need to keep in mind that our culture speaks double-tongued. So, the Women's March is a great example. Millions of women marching for whatever, but they're not marching for the preborn women in the womb. That is not worth the effort to save. And as I mentioned last week, the number of abortions in America in a year makes the number of deaths by handguns look like a drop in the bucket. But where's the outcry about abortions? Innocent babies being torn out of the womb. Where's the outcry? Well, maybe it was strong in the 80s and the 90s, but it sort of simmered down, and abortions have dropped some. But there were some courageous men and women who really stood up and fought in the 80s to get that message out, and it had a powerful impact, but not in our culture. The reason why young girls now are far more pro-life than they were 30 years ago is because of videos of babies in the womb. And I know it because I speak in high schools all the time. And now I ask the question every time I speak on bioethics, whether it's Southeast High School or Venice High School or Sarasota High School, how many of you are pro-life and how many are pro-choice? Years ago, it was always completely pro-choice with maybe one pro-lifer who would do that. Well, they're not more Christian, but all of a sudden, it's about 75% pro-life. Every year I go, 25% pro-choice, and sometimes the entire class, hour after hour for the entire day, is almost all pro-life. Well, what made that difference? It was the inescapable evidence on video that that's a baby in that womb. It was truth that made that difference. So when we are talking about speaking to our culture, we have to speak truth in an effective manner, because our culture is saying one thing while holding up the exact opposite, and they don't see the inconsistency. A great example is the movie Black Panther, which I saw a video of a woman promoted this week as the incredible expression. Now, whether the movie is good or bad is irrelevant, but that it is an example of diversity. And then she went on to describe how everybody in the movie is black, every camera person, every sound person, everybody. No diversity in the people who made the movie. So what she meant was, by this movie being added to the movie selection, that's diversity. Well, what she presented was the people who made the movie, it was a championship of diversity when it was just the opposite. It was very exclusive. But to the culture, that sounds wonderful. So we're speaking to people who don't see the hypocrisy or inconsistency. They don't see the disconnect between saying we're for women's rights, but kill 600,000 female babies in the womb. They don't see that as being a conflict at all. So keep in mind the audience so that we can communicate somehow with compassion and truth and try to really make a difference. And it might often be the way we're doing it. And those of us who were really involved in the pro-life movement in the 80s, we realized the tactic wore thin, and the tactic became counterproductive. As powerful as the rescue movement was and how it changed my own personal ministry, and for me and Coley both, there was a point where it was no longer effective to hold up the pictures of aborted babies on the street. It was repelling people from the issue. Going into schools and talking about life in the womb, that was welcomed information, eye-opening information, and began to change hearts and minds without doing this to people. So when I started changing my approach, I stopped even saying the word abortion in those speeches at schools. Don't even bring it up. I don't talk about saline abortions or DNCs, and don't even talk about it. Just talk about life in the womb. It answers the question without slapping them upside the face with the horror of what abortion is. And this new generation is more open-minded than we like to give them credit for. We think they're so millennial and so fuzzy out there, but they're incredibly open-minded for truth if we'll give it to them in a way they can hear it that we don't repeat the mistake of the 60s when the church just denounced the hippie movement rather than saying, well, what are they really asking for? What are they really looking for? And do we not have that? We could have responded a little bit differently. I hate for us to miss the opportunity now. Well, before we go, because it's 7:20, we're going to have to close off. Next Wednesday night's issue is going to be, oh, sure.
As asking for, I guess, the token millennial's opinion. So I guess the way I kind of have a soft spot, let me say first, I think the Second Amendment is something worth dying for. If it was something I was having to choose between, it would be something worth fighting for, worth dying for. But that being said, I don't know what to do about the big divide, because the opinions that are represented in this room are like a very rare majority of what's being at least proclaimed, and then definitely of my generation, and having discussions with people of very different political leanings. I struggle with how to, as Christians, because my mind always goes to serving. How do we serve people that differ from us? How do we serve people? How do we love people? I think that maybe that answered the question. We have to love them in order to serve them. But so maybe your opinion on having more life experience and dealing with different issues, how do we not mess up the witness that we can have and the testimony that we can have? How are we to be effective when the opinion is, there's a big gulf in between where most of us sit and where the culture is headed? And obviously you said it on the podcast, which I'll promote right now. We're going to be debuting a podcast here in a couple of weeks, hopefully. It's on this issue. But yeah, how do you do that? How does someone maybe like me that has conservative leanings but is trying to minister to a more and more secular culture, how do you do that? What's the smartest way of doing that?
Well, I have limited experience, but I can tell you what I have learned from my experience, and it's on the issues of abortion and bioethics, and talking to prime ministers and parliamentarians in Morocco about Islam and Christianity back when 9/11 happened. And what I have learned is that the information we share alone is going to be offensive enough that if we can speak dispassionately to people, listen to them, give credence and respect to they have a point of view that's just as valid in the culture as ours is, and not speak antagonistically or insultingly or belittlingly or uninformed, and not just have our answer ready when they speak, that it's already sitting here waiting to be fired, excuse the pun with the gun, but that they're saying, and we just want them to shut up so we can throw off our weapon that we've always had sitting back there, but rather listen and really engage, knowing that in that one conversation, you're not going to change their mind, but you plant a seed. And the seed has to go in there delicately and kindly and salted with love, and maybe it will grow, and there'll be a second and a third. And I would say in my conversations with, in a few weeks I'm speaking at the Florida Bioethics Network conference in Miami. It's lawyers and nurses and philosophers and doctors and about 500, sometimes to 800 of them. And I'm going to get to speak in one of the sessions. Well, that right has been achieved over 25 years, being in these meetings, listening, not condemning, not just if they ask, give them my point of view, but present it like this, not like this. Now, I would say I'm far less effective speaking to Christians. I make Christians mad all the time. But to the unsaved world, I figured out how to relate to them by just bring the tone down. Listen, talk, share. And, well, here's my thought. Here's my opinion. If I can help, let me know. And it sits there for a while. Because we're in no hurry. And the Lord's going to make the change if there's going to be one. But we should never withhold the truth for the sake of not alienating somebody. But the truth must be given, but it might not need to be given in that conversation. That might be the preparatory phase of the soil, so you can put the truth in there the next time you talk. And that would be, so listen more and talk less, I guess. But when we do talk, don't talk so agitated and don't talk so angry to people who have a completely different worldview than we do, because we're not going to win them over. Ed, you had one more comment, and then were you pointing for him?
The basic comment is laws. The laws are on the book. It's the enforcement. So they're trying to drop. But yet we're trying to be presented above, push that down, and let's go above that, putting out these ideas, the next shooting, more ideas and more ideas and more laws, and this level where the laws are is just
Yes.
on the book.
Think how many laws there were in the 50s, and then how many shootings were there like this? Always murders, but mass shootings in churches, schools, malls, movie theaters in the 50s. So what did the laws accomplish? Our culture has rotted underneath us, and laws don't fix a rotting culture. One more thing?
Yeah, this might actually be more what Ed was looking for from me, but one of the things that's helped me tremendously, and so I thought I might share this with you, is when you realize that in the opinion of the majority of these people that I've talked to that maybe disagree or feel like way, I guess, assuming, forgive me, but most of us fall on the right side a little bit, that they're way left. One thing I've realized is their worldview, as Pastor Dave just said, is that legislation is what solves our problems, where maybe we don't feel the same way. And so there's an amazing amount of grace that can come from you when you realize that they're using a different tool to solve a problem, and it's the tool that they think is the best. And for me, that's brought a lot of my maybe vitriolic or anger-filled reactionary type stuff down, because I've realized they're trying to solve a problem just like I am. So we need to be able to discuss which one of us is right. Is it a combination? Because we're both at the end of the day trying to solve a pretty bad problem. So that's helped me.
It's true, and it's even true in the abortion issue. Pro-choice people many of them have the very best intent. They're trying to stop what they see as being an oppressive, violent experience for some women to have pregnancies they don't want and not have to go get a back alley abortion. So their intent is to solve the issue, but they have a different moral position and a sanctity of life position, so they interpret the data differently. Well, we got to give them the benefit of the doubt that we know you mean well, so I'm not attacking your character or your heart. It's the analysis that I want us to discuss. That's a hard thing to do. So for next week, what I'd like you to do, because this is the preparation study seed planter. It's going to be the LGBTQ issues and the church. So that's what we're going to talk about next week, and it might be a 2-week conversation, but take this home with you, read through it, get familiar with the terminology, because the terminology is confusing. We want to make sure we understand what we're talking about, and then ask ourselves some honest questions about these issues and what's really pertinent to the church. So read through it, pray about it, and then hopefully we'll see you next Wednesday night as well as we talk about that issue. And if you have any more things about gun violence in America, feel free to email me, and I'll put it into my files when we address this stuff on another day and time. I'll wait till Matt's done passing those out, and then we'll have prayer and we'll be dismissed. Thank you for being willing to come and be engaged in this. I hope you think it's not a futile effort. It's a educational exercise that we can all grow from, because there is wisdom going this way. All the wisdom in this church isn't from here to here. It's also this way and from the here to here. I try to listen as best I can and modify and learn from our church members. So we're feeding each other by doing this exchange. And anything that tamps down the emotion so the logic can come to the forefront is a good exercise. All right, let's pray. Heavenly Father, I do thank you that, again, we can meet in freedom and discuss this openly. Even if we have wildly variant views, we could still talk about it with no threat of government intrusion or surveillance or encroachment into our rights. We thank you for that privilege. May we utilize it wisely. The freedom that we have of free speech and the free exercise of religion in America. And then, Father, help us to be informed, help us to be clear-minded, logically thoughtful, analytical, passionate, courageous, consistent, and persistent, and then help us be salt and light to our culture who doesn't know they need it, but is in desperate need of true salt and light from the Church of Jesus Christ. May you bless each person who came tonight. In Jesus' name, amen. I can't stay around and talk to y'all. I've got to go to another meeting, but I will see you on Sunday.